Hi, everybody. Welcome to English 116, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 10th, where we are putting some closure onto the syllabus, and then we are beginning with some introductory readings to establish a foundation before we begin reading some text and actually watching some film. But if you will look in the notes below, you will see that I have provided you with multiple links. And hopefully these will be links that will help you if you're having difficulty acquiring a textbook. So we are using the 13th edition in class. That is the most recent edition, but one of my students was able to find a link to the 11th edition. And as I indicated last class, you are free to use any edition of the textbook. So that is below. Obviously, your page numbers will be different, but you can look in the index in the back of the book to find the information, or you can also look in the table of contents to find the information of where the readings are that we are doing over the course of the semester. And there's also a copy of the book on reserve in the GCC library that you can scan or take pictures of. You can't take the book out, but you can certainly read it there as well. Now, the book basically is divided up into two pieces. The first, where it gives some content about reading and writing about literature, which I also will be supplementing. And then there's the actual literature that we are going to be reading. And we are starting with short stories. And it turns out that I am able to find, or have been able to find, links for all of these short stories. And if you'll see in the notes below, I have included the online links for all of these short stories. So if on the syllabus it says handout, these links would be applicable. But even when it doesn't say handout and there are page numbers, I have been able to find links. At least they were active this weekend. I hope they remain active. I don't ask questions about copyright. And we will begin with reading a short story called The Secret Sorrow. And you can see that I put all of these in chronological order, in the order in which we will be addressing them in class. And the link is there. And the next is A Sorrowful Woman. And the next is The Story of an Hour. And the next is Rose for Emily. And the next is Young Goodman Brown. And the next is Soldier's Home. And the next is Battle Royal. And the last is Popular Mechanics. So those are all of the short stories that we are going to be reading in the short story section. So they are in your textbook. I've given you the page numbers for the most recent edition of the textbook, the 13th edition. You can use older editions. If you use an older edition, the page numbers will be different. But again, you can find that information by just going to the index, where you can find a listing of authors or titles, and you can look up the thing that you happen to be searching for. The table of contents at the beginning will review all of the major elements that are in the textbook, including those sections that are devoted to how to read and write about literature. And I will also be supplementing the readings with additional information about film, because this is also a film and lit class. So hopefully that will simplify things for you in terms of the readings. And when I talked about the syllabus in the last class, I had indicated I'm not using the Moodle grading program, so that if you look onto Moodle and you see something odd with the grading program, it's because I'm not using it. So if you ever have questions about your grades, you can just ask me. And the previous week, and we haven't gotten there yet because we're still completing our first week, but what I will do is retire that previous week and put it into our class sessions folder. And then the current week is the week that you will see at the front of our Moodle page. And that will be obvious next week when we move into the second week of the semester. And the piece that I didn't talk about in the syllabus is about plagiarism. And it used to be a fairly easy conversation that plagiarism is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So that's the key, is that you've got to give credit. And it's a pretty serious academic offense. You could actually be expelled from college with a notation on your transcript that you were expelled because of plagiarism if you're found to be conducting something that is plagiarism. And there are lots of different ways you can plagiarize, and there are lots of different ways for teachers to determine if you're plagiarizing. And I used to tell, notice I'm using the past tense, two stories to encourage people not to plagiarize. And the first happened to me actually very early in my career, pre-internet, so I wasn't able to rely on the internet. I'm reading a student paper that sounds familiar. And I realized it's familiar. Again, I couldn't go to the internet. I had to think about where I'd read this before. And I realized very quickly that where I read it before was our college textbook, that the student was actually lifting sections from the college textbook with a few mechanical errors here and there. I don't know if they were deliberate errors to basically deceive me, or if it was just a case of somebody who was sloppy with their plagiarism. The better story occurred around the same time, but that means pre-internet. Did not occur to me. It happened to a middle-aged professor. That part's important. He's reading papers and he realizes something sounds familiar. And as he is contemplating where he has read this before, he realizes he hadn't read it. He'd written it decades earlier when he was an undergraduate student. It was one of his old papers. And it turns out that somehow, some way, the student got a hold of that paper. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers. But again, what are the chances of something like this happening? And it was in all of the academic newspapers at the time because it was just so absurd that something like this could happen. Yes, there is such a thing as academic newspapers. So those were the two stories I would tell about plagiarism to encourage people not to plagiarize. Things have become much more complex with artificial intelligence, which is changing by the day, seemingly. And this is my request, that you not use artificial intelligence, at least in this particular class. It certainly has its time and place in other situations, but let me explain my thinking a little bit about this. I suppose if you are a doomsday person, you might think about things like machines taking over civilization. It's a common theme with, let's say, something like the Terminator film series, where machines become self-aware. I'm less concerned about that than I am about, I think, things that are much more practical. And one of those happen to be the ethics associated with artificial intelligence. And that ultimately, artificial intelligence is gathering information and data that was created by humans. And these humans are not getting credit for their intellectual property. And we've already talked about how that's plagiarism. In addition, there are environmental issues with artificial intelligence that I don't think are really examined very thoroughly, or haven't been examined very thoroughly. Artificial intelligence uses a lot of energy and it uses a lot of water. I think there are significant consequences with us diverting our resources to that element of society. The third issue with artificial intelligence that is perhaps an issue is, I think, a particularly problematic issue, the speed in which artificial intelligence is moving. So if you know your history, you know about the Industrial Revolution and how long it took for this gigantic transformation in society. We are experiencing that gigantic transformation now, but it's happening at an incredible speed, a speed that has never been seen before. And there are and will be social and economic implications associated with that we can't even envision. And I worry very much about that. But in the end, when it comes down to gathering information from artificial intelligence, I don't know if you've ever heard about how artificial intelligence sometimes has a tendency to, quote, hallucinate, unquote, which I find to be a troublesome term because that means that there's some sort of sentience there. But nevertheless, that some of the information is incorrect. And more than just incorrect, some of it is just completely fictional. And there have been plenty of stories of professionals who've used artificial intelligence, lawyers, for instance, to cite court cases that it turns out never existed, even though artificial intelligence insists that these court cases exist. But when judges have done their own research, they don't exist. So, the idea is that you don't really know what you don't know. And if you are just relying on artificial intelligence blindly, then you're taking great risk because it could easily be giving you misinformation, disinformation, or flat out fiction. So you put all of those things together, and those are the reasons why I would prefer that you not use it. And in this class, while it's certainly lovely to learn about literature and lovely to learn about film, I have grander goals, and those are to encourage thinking and reasoning. And we do utilize those skills through the interpretation of literature. And I can tell you, I've changed my classes because of artificial intelligence, that the paper prompts, the final examination questions are really more about argumentation than they are about regurgitation of facts. And I can tell you that 25%, which is a large amount of your grade, is due to or is devoted to classroom participation, your discussion forum questions, which again will be questions that are oftentimes based on opinion and argumentation, not necessarily on facts. So when you put all of these things together, I'm certainly hopeful that I've convinced you not to use artificial intelligence, at least in this class. And I believe I mentioned last class that I teach media classes. One of my media students found a great video talking about it was social media and how social media has really taken away a lot of the control that we have had in the past, and also likening social media to fast food. And I've included this video. It's about 14 minutes long or so, but I think it's worth your watching because if you substituted the term social media with artificial intelligence, I think it works very nicely. And that metaphor, that comparison between social media, or if in this case, artificial intelligence, with the idea of empty calories and the way that it ultimately doesn't necessarily provide the benefits that we think it provides, I think is a very useful way to be cautious about our use and reliance on the information we're getting from artificial intelligence. So that's in the notes below in the third section. In the fourth section, the notes below, I have some of the information from the introductory set of readings, which I'm well aware that you might not have had a chance to do, though you can certainly do them after the fact. And they basically help to establish the foundation for what we will be using for when we analyze film and when we analyze literature. And literature, and we'll think about film as a kind of literature, doesn't lend itself to a tidy definition. That's basically the summary of that particular reading. And one of the exercises that I do in my face-to-face classes, I try to generate a definition of literature. And while there are certain elements associated with literature, it's probably written text. Though if you think about the early days of literature and the oral tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey, it wasn't written, but luckily it eventually was written so that we've got the records and the text now that we can read. I suppose in the broadest sense of the word, it's anything that's written, but when I go to a store asking for a piece of literature on the washing machine, I'm asking for the instruction manual. I'm not necessarily asking for the kinds of literature that we would read in an academic classroom, that it usually is involving some level of storytelling, and people love stories. Kids love stories. It's one of the first things kids ask for is tell me a story. And that within these stories, there are usually lessons that are embedded in there, arguments and perspectives that the authors have. But rather than preaching to us, they're going to embed them within a story. You don't have to necessarily agree with the author's perspective, but you need to be able to identify it. And that literature, the kind that's worth academic study in a classroom, should broaden our perspectives. And hopefully, yes, it can entertain, but it will do more than just entertain. It'll provide social commentary, and it'll also use language in interesting ways. So those are some of the elements that perhaps we could use to define literature. I have a layperson's definition of literature. It's anything that can be reread, and each time you reread it, it brings forth new meaning. So, as many times as I've read these works, each time I reread it, I find a little gem that I never noticed before. Or better yet, one of my students has found a little gem that I've never noticed before. I don't see that happening with the instruction manual for the air conditioner. Once you've read it, you've read it. There isn't any need to reread it. Now, if you're wondering what happens when you read literature, there is a fascinating article that was in the New York Times, and you can see in the notes below on the fourth section that I've included that for you to read. It's called Your Brain on Fiction, but I can summarize a little bit of that article for you, where basically MRI scans were done on individuals who were reading to try to determine what happens in the brain when we read. And yes, the areas of the brain associated with language processing are activated. But what is much more interesting is that the other areas of the brain, based on the content we're reading, are also activated. So, for instance, if you're reading content about an arm, the area of the brain that's responsible for movements of arm, those areas are activated. If you're reading about, let's say, a hand, then ultimately the areas of the brain associated with hand are activated. And the studies are international. It's one of the things I like about this. And that words associated with scent, for instance, like lavender, cinnamon, and soap, activate those areas of the brain associated with scent, even though we can't smell these words. So, one of the studies that they identify from Spain is that brain scans were examined when individuals read words that were associated with odors, words like perfume and coffee. And again, the area of the brain associated with scent was activated. And when they read other words not associated with scent, such as chair and key, those areas of the brain were not activated. And this also worked with figures of speech. So something like saying, I had a rough day, that when you use a metaphor involving texture and comparison, like rough day, the sensory cortex, the area of the brain responsible for perceiving texture, is activated. But when you say something like, he had a difficult day, that area of the brain is not activated. So when you say things like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands, that will activate the sensory cortex. But similar phrases like the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands do not activate that area of the brain. Same thing was found with studies that were conducted in France when subjects read very simple sentences like John grasped the object or Pablo kicked the ball, that the areas of the motor cortex coordinating body movements were activated, and that the area of the motor cortex associated with that specific body part is what was activated. What does all this mean? That the brain doesn't seem to make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life. Think about what this might mean. That fiction, with all of its details and descriptions, offers an especially rich replica of life, almost like a computer simulation, allowing us to fully enter into other people's thoughts and feelings, which is something that we really can't do. People can tell us what they think, what they feel, but we don't necessarily know if that's accurate or if they're telling the truth. And that this means that people who read ultimately are able to experience things, at least from the way that brain scans have been activated, even though they're not experiencing those things. Now, certainly there's a difference between reading about love and experiencing it. Anybody who's ever had the experience of love will tell you that. But it seems that the areas of the brain that are activated would be the same. So it allows you to get to as close as possible to reality without actually having that particular experience. This says a lot for empathy, the ability to be able to understand people's past, people's perspectives, people's ideologies. Think about what this could mean for our society. And in fact, it was found that people who read more are more empathetic, and they also try to make sure that they accounted for the possibility that more empathetic people might be drawn to reading in the first place. So I say all of this because reading allows us to understand different peoples, different time periods, different perspectives, which is another reason why it's so valuable to study literature. Not because it helps to improve our reasoning skills and our thinking skills, but also because I think it allows us to understand humanity, because ultimately literature, in one way or another, is about the human experience. So, again, you can certainly read that article if you are so inclined. And one of the things that we talk about when we talk about literature is that it oftentimes is subjective when we're talking about what is good or worthy of academic study. There's a word for this. It's called canon. Those works considered by scholars and critics that are worth academic study. And some of those works are works that have become part of our common cultural understanding. Shakespeare, for instance, people usually assume that Shakespeare is something that you're going to study in a literature classroom because scholars and critics have said that it's great. And some of the students in those classes have become teachers themselves, and then they transfer the same information from generation to generation. And while there are criteria that you can utilize to evaluate the strength of a particular piece of literature or the strength of a particular piece of writing, there also is bias associated when individuals like scholars and critics and teachers make determinations as to what is considered to be a great piece of literature. And the textbook talks about a very interesting phenomenon with the text you might have heard of before, Moby Dick, that when it first appeared, it wasn't considered by scholars or critics to be a great piece of literature. It was considered to be a study of whales, and it was filed accordingly in that section in the library until it was discovered or rediscovered to be this great piece of writing, or at least that's what scholars and critics say. It's a great piece of writing. And while chances are you've heard of Moby Dick, the chances also are that you've never read Moby Dick. You just know that it's supposed to be good. So I mention all of this because I want us to think a little bit about how literature has been identified by scholars and critics as what we should study, and other pieces of literature identified by scholars and critics what we probably wouldn't study. And it's not that easy, especially when you start thinking about the early days of literary studies, where mostly the scholars and critics were Caucasian, heterosexual male, and the students were as well. And of course, as time went on, when you've got a more diverse population amongst the student body and the teaching body, questions arise, especially when all of the readings seem to reflect that particular perspective. So there's lots of controversy associated with the canon. Where are the marginalized voices, for instance? This came to a head in the 1960s. The 60s were a particularly tumultuous time, if you don't know anything about the 1960s. And certainly the idea was, what do we do with the canon? Do we just continue to study what is known as the classics, even though it omits many different perspectives and voices that might have just as much quality, maybe even more so? Or do we add those voices and perspectives? But that means more reading. That means we double, triple the amount of reading that we do. Or do we start at ground zero and we start fresh? But again, that we still have the problem of bias and how we make determinations. So keep this in mind when I begin to review how studying literature became a profession, much like law and medicine has become a profession. People actually make a living doing this. Usually they're university professors. And that's the difference, by the way, between a college and a university. If you don't know, at a university, you focus on research if you're teaching at a university or working at a university. And if you're working at a college, you focus on teaching. That's not to say that you can't do research at the college level, and that's certainly not to say that you don't teach at the university level. It's just a difference of focus. And those individuals who focused on research, they ended up coming up with literary studies from a professional perspective, and they determined not only the canon initially, but how to read that canon. And this, if you've read it in the textbook, is again introductory and somewhat dry. And I'm oversimplifying here. I just wanted to give you an overview of how the profession could work. And this is in the 5th section under Critical Strategies for Reading, where basically in the 1800s, there were a group of individuals, those scholars and critics, who called themselves formalists. And they studied the formal elements of a piece of literature, of a work. Things like the language, the structure, the tone. And then around the 1940s to the 1960s is when a group of critics came out, and they gave themselves the name New Critics. I think it's a poor term because what was new in the 1960s is obviously not new now. Now I guess they're old critics. But nevertheless, they were doing something different. The formalists had assumed that you needed to have some understanding of literary background. You needed to know definitions of things like irony and metaphor. You needed to understand how language worked and narration in order to study it. The new critics basically said that anybody can interpret literature through a close reading of the text itself. Now, certainly the more you know about literature, the better the reading, but you could be 6 years old, 16 years old, 26 years old, and all of those ages can read a poem by, let's say, Emily Dickinson. Now, certainly, I suspect the 26-year-old is going to be able to do a better job than the 6-year-old, but assuming you know how to read, you can begin to look at things like how language is used, irony, which is the exact opposite of something that you are expecting, but with a twist. So I believe the example given to you in your textbook is when a firehouse burns down. The best example I can give from irony is from actually a piece of popular culture. And it's a television show from the 1960s called The Twilight Zone, and 1950s, which was quite popular in terms of its storytelling, and they utilize some of the best short story writers of the day. So it's a wonderful way to examine short story. And it was one episode entitled Time Enough at Last, which you might know of. And it happened to be about a man who was basically a henpecked husband and employee. He was kind of incompetent at work. He worked at a bank and was continually nagged by his boss. And he was kind of incompetent at home. And he was nagged by his wife for not paying attention to chores and really only wanting to spend his time reading. And of course, you're not supposed to read at work. So that was also something that would get him into trouble. Now, it turns out, of course, like, as with every television show, and most stories, you're going to have to suspend a little bit of disbelief. And it turns out that the disbelief we have to suspend is that when this employee locked himself into the bank vault after everyone had gone home, so he had to stay in that vault overnight. Remember, no cells. We're talking about the 1950s here, that he somehow survived the nuclear blast that went off that destroyed society around him. But what we see is him basically crawling out of the ruins of the bank vault. He's still alive, and at first just horrified by the destruction he sees because everybody is dead. And then he's pleased when he realizes that everybody is dead, including his wife and his boss, because this now means that he could devote himself to reading, which is what he wants to do. So suspend a little bit more disbelief where he's able to crawl to a library that is in ruins, but the books are still intact. And he gathers all of the books and he's getting ready to read. He has time enough at last to read. It turns out he's wearing very thick Coca-Cola bottle glasses. He has very poor eyesight, probably because of all the reading he's done. And at the time, eyeglasses would have been made out of glass, not plastic. And as he looks down at his stack of books, his eyeglasses slip off his face and they shatter onto the ground. And now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And that's the best example of irony that I can think of. Or something like a literary term called paradox, two seemingly contradictory terms that in reality support one another. Or symbolism, something that is representational, usually something that is concrete that represents something that's not concrete. A flag, a concrete object, represents something that's not concrete, something like patriotism, which is more of an emotion. And this symbol might seem obvious, but you weren't born knowing this symbol. This was taught to you and me and us, though we might not remember how and when and why. And then there are other symbols that are less obvious that we perhaps might see an author utilizing in their piece of literature. Or metaphor, comparing two dissimilar things without using the words like or as. When you use like or as, that is a simile. Or plot, which is the most basic element of a text, what happened. But while we need to establish what happened, what's much more important, and this is how we'll spend our time in class, is talking about why those things happened. Or who are the characters, or who's telling the story. And these are skills that we oftentimes use in our day-to-day relationships. That when we're getting information, we're not just evaluating the information we're getting, we're evaluating who is giving us that information. Some people are more trustworthy than others, just like some narrators are more trustworthy than others. So these new critics said that, yes, as the formalists said, if you have an understanding of these terms and you've learned about them, you can examine literature. But the new critics are saying you can still examine these elements without knowing all of the literary terms. Just do a close reading of the text and see what jumps out at you. Now, these new critics, you can almost think about them as kind of like general practitioners for medicine. And eventually, and I think part of it had to do with the job market becoming a lot more difficult, you ended up with specialists, people who are focusing on specific areas. And luckily, they oftentimes chose terms that were related to their specific specialty. And while it's wonderful to be a specialist, it can also be very limiting, as in medicine, that a specialist, a cardiologist, for instance, might be so focused on the heart that they miss something that's obvious that a general practitioner would find because they aren't focusing on just the heart. The same can happen with literary critics, that yes, there is value to being a specialist, but sometimes you become so specialized that you don't see other possibilities. So I just wanted to briefly talk about some of these literary critics and some of the perspectives that they can utilize with studying a piece of literature. Not that I want you to choose one of these perspectives and view everything from that lens. Instead, know that there are groups of individuals who do that, but I think it is in our better interest to be a generalist, particularly in our early studies of literature, and the same applies to cinema. Biographical critics, they focus just on that, the biography of the author, which makes sense. Knowing the author's life helps us to understand how their life influenced their writing. But that's the key, influenced. It's not necessarily a mirror. Remember, authors are writing fiction, so their life history doesn't necessarily transfer over to the writing that they're doing. Psychological critics look at mental states, whether it's the psychology of characters, or it could be the psychology of the author who wrote the text, or it could be the psychology of the reader who's reading the text, or all of the above. And if you are taking any psychology classes, you know that psychology can oftentimes be very specialized. So usually we talk about Sigmund Freud being the father of psychology, and you can decide that you're not only a psychological critic, but you're Freudian. So you're reading everything from Freud's perspective of psychology. Or perhaps you're a Jungian and you're reading everything from Carl Jung's perspective of psychology. The historical critics look at the history of the time period, past events. Now, I took the time to put the names of the authors and the dates for all the works we're going to be reading because it's important for you to know where you are, because you need to know the time period. So if something was written in 1973, you need to know what was going on in the 1970s. And that said, obviously you can't know everything that was going on in the 1970s. And you are going to be reading it from an understanding of 2025 because that's our time period. But the world was different in the 70s. So knowing at least something about the 70s will help you because that's what influenced the author if they were writing in the 70s, even if they set their story in the past or in the future. Marxist critics look at socioeconomics, that everything is related to money, who has it and who doesn't. This is where power structures come in. New historicist critics, they have, I believe, a very poor term, just like the new critics, because new historicists were using history in new ways. They weren't just talking about wars and dates and politics. They were talking about culture. Things like the food people ate and the music they listened to and the clothing they wore and the media they consumed. And that you need to understand the culture of the time in order to understand the text. Or gender critics were looking just as that, gender, whether they were looking at one gender or multiple genders. Mythological critics, and notice how interdisciplinary all of this is, that you can use the information from other disciplines and apply them in the study of literature. Those universal stories, those myths that we tell in different cultures and different time periods over and over again, how would that apply to the literature we're reading? So, for instance, every culture has a resurrection myth. All of the myths and stories are different, but every culture has one. What does that mean about us as humanity is the question. Reader response critics. The assumption thus far with all of these schools of interpretation that I've been talking about is that there is some meaning in the text that the author is trying to put forth. How about the fact that the reader can create meaning from the text? That it's not the author, but it's the reader who creates meaning. Now, please don't mishear me and hear that, well, as a reader, I can decide what the text means. You need to have some evidence within the text. So you're almost like an attorney where you are gathering pieces of information, and a good attorney can take the prosecution or the defense, can take both sides of the case and argue effectively, even though one side might have more evidence than another. It's why so many people who are thinking about law school, myself included, end up becoming English majors because you learn how to argue different positions. There is no necessarily right position. Or as I had a very astute college professor once say, while there are no right answers in literature, there are some wrong ones. The wrong ones are the answers that don't provide any evidence. And you need to have evidence from the text. So as a reader response, you would need to have evidence from the text in order to be able to support your position. So you can't just say that a text is about space aliens without any evidence in the text. But if you can find evidence that's possible, not even probable, then you're fine. So reader response critics focus more on readers rather than on authors. Deconstructionist critics do just that. They deconstruct things, they take things apart. All of these literary movements take things apart, but specifically, deconstructionist critics are looking for contradiction. This comes from a philosophical theory from a philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who's French. Very complicated theory. And in fact, all of these theories that I'm talking about are quite complicated, and I am oversimplifying. I myself took a graduate class in college that was devoted just to literary criticism, and we're spending about 15 minutes on it, just to give you an idea of how much this is being simplified. But again, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. And the deconstructionists argued, and this was a very popular theory in the 1980s, by the way, that when you look at a text, you will always find contradiction within it. It's almost like adding a positive and a negative number where you end up with a zero. The contradiction means you end up with a zero. That you can't have a text that's both happy and sad at the same time. But of course, if you're a human being, you know that you can feel both happy and sad at the same time. Human beings are filled with contradiction. We even have words for it, things like bittersweet, where something is both positive and negative at the same time. But a deconstructionist would say, well, it can't be both positive and negative at the same time. These are like two numbers, a positive and a negative number, that cancel each other out, that negate one another, and you end up with a zero. The language used in deconstruction is that the text collapses upon itself. It implodes, if you will. Again, this was a very popular theory and a very complicated theory. How complicated? When I was learning about it in graduate school, and again, Jacques Derrida was lecturing at the time to standing room only audiences, to all the scholars and critics out there. But when I first read about deconstruction, I had no understanding of it. So, and this was before the internet. So I went to class early to see if some of my classmates had some understanding of the reading that I didn't have. And it turns out that all my classmates were already there. And again, this was a graduate level class. And so we were all specializing in this. And none of us understood the reading, which made me feel a little better. And then the professor, who was an expert in literary studies, who had been doing this for decades, he was nearing the ending of his career, walked into class and laughed and asked us how the reading was. And we all moaned. And he admitted to us that he didn't understand it either, that we would try to sort it out together, but that it was so complex that a lot of it went over his head. And what ended up happening with deconstruction, if you're curious, is that it's a lot less popular now as people began asking questions. And it's hard to explain what the problem with deconstruction is without really studying more about it. But basically, deconstruction argues that there is no meaning in anything because there's always contradiction. However, there is meaning in something, in the argument that there is no meaning. If you can wrap your head around that idea, which took scholars and critics years to get to, then you can wrap your head around the idea of how deconstruction became less popular. Jacques Derrida argued that it merely proved his theory that there's no meaning in anything. But of course, his argument assumed meaning, which seemed to negate his argument. So there are some deconstructionists that are out there, but they're not nearly as popular as they were in the 1980s and even in the 1990s. So again, I mention all of these literary schools not because I want you to go and determine that you want to read from a particular perspective, but because you should let the text determine for you which focus you are going to take. Maybe one text does lend itself to deconstruction, and actually one of the short stories that we will be reading does, and we'll talk about that as we get there. Or perhaps another text, and we can talk about film as text, leads itself to biographic criticism so that you can think about the author's biography in terms of understanding, which leads us to reading film, that you can read a film the way you would read a literary text, not just watching a film passively for entertainment, but that's perfectly fine, just like you can read passively for entertainment, but being actively involved and asking questions and annotating, taking notes. And I have a handout for you. The handout would be in the syllabus and other documents folder. So you can see this in the 7th section below, that the handout for reading film is in the syllabus and other documents folder, or you can just click on that hyperlink and you will see that a handout is there about interpreting film in the way that you can interpret literature from an academic perspective. And that movies and literature, they both utilize storytelling, but in movies, they use pictures in addition to using words to tell the story. After all, we say we watch movies. We don't say we hear movies. And we're probably more likely to watch a movie than we are to read a book. It's easier because all of the elements are given to us. We don't necessarily have to use our imaginations in the way we would when we read. Film is really the only literary form where the text moves, and it also has a sense of permanence. which is unlike live drama, that if you're watching a drama live, yes, it moves, but once it occurs, it's over. The idea that we can film it, it has an element of permanence. Certainly words have permanence, but words don't have movement associated with them. After all, we call films motion pictures because these are pictures that have motions, that basically show us things rather than just tell us things, which is what literature aspires to do, not just to tell, but to show something through a story. And if something is shown in a film, just like if something is mentioned in a piece of literature, it's probably important. Though there are exceptions to this. You might have heard of the great director Alfred Hitchcock, where he would oftentimes try to deliberately misdirect his audience by showing us something that we assume is going to be important, and it turns out it's not at all important. There's even a term for this. It was known as a MacGuffin. Now, film images offer suggestive meanings, extended meanings, just like literary texts can offer suggestions and extended meanings. The thing with film is that's more complicated than with text is you have more layers. You don't just have an author the way you do with the text and a reader, somebody who's consuming the text. You have a producer, you have a director, you have an author, you have a camera person, you have a, and just fill in the blanks. And all of those elements play a role in the story we're ultimately given. The camera ultimately is doing the thinking for us. It's directing where we focus our attention. If we're watching a live drama, yes, what's on stage is capturing our attention, but we can decide where to focus our attention on the stage. That's not going to happen in a film. The camera is going to focus our attention. We see what the director and the camera operator want us to see. And the director is usually seen as primarily responsible for the film. Think about the deification of directors in our time period, where we've got directors like Hitchcock or Spielberg, for instance, that have basically become more important than the actors, unless you've got an A-list actor in the film. Maybe this is why so many actors want to be directors, because they want to be having control. Unless you're an A-list actor with a lot of power, you need to listen to the director. You have to follow the director's orders, in effect, their direction. So, since the camera is selecting what we see and what we don't see, the thinking about camera shots is going to be incredibly important. Now, we have a much greater ability to analyze film just because of technology now, because we have home access in a way that we wouldn't have had to film in the early days of film. So we didn't have the ability to fast forward, to rewind, or just to pause for reflection. And think about how you can do that with reading. You can jump ahead, you can reread, and you can pause for reflection. But now we can do that very easily with film as well. Well, it started with VHS, and we've moved to DVD, and then we moved to streaming. So, film, just like literature, is oftentimes classified by a genre or a category. If you think about Netflix, how films are oftentimes divided into different categories, and a film can fit sometimes into many different kinds of categories. Frankenstein, for instance, is often listed as a horror film, but it can also be a science fiction film. In film, one of the more difficult things to do is to show a character's internal mental state. That's much easier to do with literature because you can read about what a character is thinking. In film, there has to be dialogue to show what a character is thinking, or there's got to be a voiceover or something so that we can hear their thoughts. And when we talk about movie magic, the idea of illusion, that does include special effects, but it's not limited to special effects, as we will talk about when we talk about film a little bit more next class. You can assume that a movie, will be divided into three pieces: a beginning, a middle, and end. And I guess that's true of all stories, beginning, a middle, and end. The way that it's divided up, usually the first piece, Act 1, the beginning, is approximately a half hour. This is where we get our introduction to characters. The second piece is about a half hour to an hour. This is where you get your body or the conflict of the story. And then the last piece, Act 3, is about a half hour. This is where we get resolution, where you can assume that your average film is going to be somewhere in the area of about an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. Though certainly you can have films that vary, but if you've got a film that's too long, you've got an antsy audience. You've got a film that's too short, you have an audience that feels cheated. Some of the terminology that we use, since we covered some terminology with literature. For film, a frame is a single shot, and each shot should tell a story. A shot is just a picture, and there are 24 frames per second. This is where we see the movement coming in. Scenes are a series of frames that tell a story, and a sequence are multiple scenes that tell a story. And things to consider when you are watching a film: the choreography, the movement, all of that is blocked out. The cinematography, the filming, the sound, the audio, and that's not just dialogue, but that's also musical score. The framing, what you see in a scene and what you don't. The cutting of the editing, the fading, the dissolving when you go from one scene and shot to another. All of those are elements to consider. If you've ever watched the Academy Awards, you know how many people are involved in the creation of a film. The camera angles, the lighting, the distances. Usually a medium shot gives us the most information, medium distance away, as compared to a close-up where we've got to focus on a specific element, or a long shot, a very far distance focus, not on any particular element. Other terms: dollying, when you run a camera back and forth. Zooming, when you close in or you go farther away. Some of these are terms that we use with photography, for instance, because film is basically photography. Panning, a stationary camera moving from side to side. Sound, as I indicated, isn't just dialogue or sound effects. Sound effects are very important too, but musical score. And even just the film stock, whether it's color or black and white. Obviously, in the early days of film, there wasn't much of a choice. Now, black and white suggests a kind of distance or nostalgia, or sets a mood or a tone. So that's the overview that we have in terms of film and literature. So we've been talking about canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics that are worth academic study, whether it be a written text or a film. So today's attendance question is, what do you think is valuable in terms of determining canon? What makes something worth academic study, whether it be film or whether it be text? And as you know, you have 48 hours in which to respond to your discussion forum responses. So you have up until this Saturday. But certainly if you need an extension, let me know. And as I had indicated before, you're not required to respond to the attendance question responses from your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses. Much like in a face-to-face class, you might perhaps participate by giving some information during a class discussion, but you're not necessarily required to. I know some people learn more through listening, some people learn more through engaging in conversation, or some combination thereof. And if you read all of the discussion forum responses and my responses in turn, what you'll get is a good idea of the class discussion. So our last class discussion question was an introduction, so I just wanted to briefly introduce myself and let you know that in the discussion forum, you don't have to start a new thread. You can just continue on. But for my introduction, I was born and raised in New York City, attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester, a place that advertised itself as having real winters, which meant that those winters were brutal. And there I was studying English, minoring in psychology, because I was absolutely positively certain that I was going to be an attorney, which is why I was majoring in English and minoring in psychology. And both are very useful for law school. But what ended up happening was, as oftentimes happens in school, that I realized that what I really wanted to do was not pursue law, but to pursue literature. And That meant that I would be going to graduate school rather than law school. And I chose a school that was in a warm climate because I didn't want any more real winters. And that was in Southern California, UCLA, where I was studying Shakespeare and his contemporaries because that was my primary interest in literature. Graduated, began teaching, and realized that I missed the winter after all, so I wanted to return home, which for me meant anything on the East Coast. And what I ended up doing was applying for a position in a place that I had never heard of before called Greenfield, Massachusetts. So you know how this story ends. And basically, what I learned was that Greenfield, Massachusetts, or at least according to my interview committee, did have winters that were, quote, not that bad, as they told me. And I started in 1993. And you might know that year because it was a historical year, because it was one of the most brutal winters on record in Massachusetts. I was completely unprepared. But nevertheless, I stayed and mostly teaching English classes, but branching out over the years with media classes, popular culture classes, public speaking classes. So basically, your job now is to answer the attendance question about canon. And there are no right or wrong answers here. As you can see, many of these are opinion based. I'm just more interested in your thoughts and reflections and your reasoning. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about literature and talking about film before we watch our first film, which happens to be Citizen Kane. And we'll talk about why we are watching that film and why that film is so important historically. Take care. Bye-bye.